Jack Harrison walked back into Thompson Industries just before midnight, tie loosened, exhausted from another late shift that kept him away from an apartment he couldn't bear to enter. The building should have been empty, everyone gone. But as he crossed the dark executive floor, he heard music, faint, almost ghostly. The CEO's office door stood half open. What he saw inside made him freeze. Claire Thompson, the most powerful woman in the company, was doing something no one was ever meant to witness. In that breathless moment of silence, Jack whispered the only words that came. "Let me join." Jack had been working late more often than he cared to admit. It wasn't that Thompson Industries demanded it. The finance department cleared out by 6 most evenings. But going home meant walking into silence, into rooms that still smelled faintly of lavender from candles his wife used to light. 3 years since cancer took her, and the apartment still felt like a crime scene he couldn't leave behind. So he stayed. He filed reports that didn't need filing. He reviewed spreadsheets already reviewed. Anything to delay the moment when he'd turn his key in the lock and hear nothing but his own breathing. Tonight had been no different. He'd told himself he needed to grab a file from his desk, something about quarterly projections that could easily wait until morning. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He just didn't want to go home yet. The building was supposed to be empty. Security made rounds at 11, and after that, the place became a tomb of glass and steel. Jack liked it that way. No eyes on him. No forced small talk. Just the hum of the HVAC system and the glow of his computer screen. But as he crossed the executive floor, something felt wrong. The air carried a faint trace of music, barely audible, like a radio left on in another room. Jack stopped. The executive floor was never occupied this late. Claire Thompson, the CEO, worked brutal hours, but even she went home eventually. He'd seen her leaving around 9, heels clicking against marble, briefcase in hand, face carved from the same ice that built her reputation. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. She ran Thompson Industries the way a surgeon ran an operating room, cold, precise, untouchable. The music grew louder as Jack moved toward her office. The door stood half open, light spilling into the hallway. He should have turned around, should have left. But curiosity pulled him forward, the kind that makes people slow down at accidents. He reached the doorway and looked inside. What he saw didn't make sense at first. His brain couldn't process it. Claire Thompson stood in the center of her office, barefoot, wearing a red dress he'd never seen her in. She was dancing, not the careful, controlled movements of someone practicing for an event. This was raw, unguarded, her arms lifted, her body swayed, and her face was wet with tears. The music came from her phone, propped on the desk, something classical, strings and piano. Jack didn't recognize it, but it sounded old, heavy with grief. Claire moved through the space like she was fighting something invisible, her bare feet sliding across the polished floor. She spun, and for a moment, her eyes were closed, her mouth open in a silent cry. This wasn't the woman who stood at podiums and announced quarterly earnings. This was someone breaking apart in the only place she thought no one would see. Jack knew he should leave. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to let her have this moment, to pretend he'd never climbed those stairs. But he didn't move. He couldn't, because what he saw in her face was something he recognized. It was the same thing he saw in his own mirror every morning. The look of someone who'd survived something they weren't sure they wanted to survive. The look of someone still here, still breathing, but not quite living. Then Claire opened her eyes. She saw him. The music kept playing, but everything else stopped. Her body went rigid. Her arms dropped to her sides. For 3 long seconds, neither of them moved. Jack felt his throat tighten. He'd just destroyed something, invaded something sacred. She was going to fire him. Worse, she was going to look at him the way people looked at voyeurs, at intruders. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, but the words that came out were different. "Let me join." He didn't know why he said it. It made no sense. He wasn't a dancer. He hadn't danced since his wedding, hadn't wanted to, hadn't been able to imagine moving that way with anyone else. But standing there, watching Claire Thompson break open in her red dress, he felt something shift. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the simple, terrible understanding that they were both drowning in the same dark water, just in different rooms. Claire stared at him. Her face was unreadable now, the mask slipping back into place, but her eyes stayed wet. She didn't wipe them, didn't speak. The music played on, filling the silence between them. Jack thought she was going to tell him to leave, to forget what he'd seen, to never speak of this again. But she didn't. She just stood there, barefoot and trembling, looking at him like he was a door she'd been afraid to open. Jack Harrison wasn't anyone important at Thompson Industries. He worked in finance, mid-level, unremarkable. He filed reports and attended meetings and nodded when senior management spoke. He'd been with the company for 7 years, long enough to know how things worked, long enough to understand the hierarchy. Claire Thompson was at the top, untouchable, unreachable, the kind of person you saw in elevators but never spoke to unless spoken to first. She'd built the company from nothing after her husband died, turned it into something formidable. People respected her. People feared her. No one knew her. But Jack knew loss. He knew what it looked like when someone tried to outrun it. His wife had fought cancer for 2 years, and he'd watched her fade in increments, watched her become someone else, someone smaller, until the day she wasn't there at all. Everyone told him time would help, that he'd heal, that he'd move on. But 3 years later, he was still here, still working late, still avoiding home, still pretending he had a reason to keep going. His daughter Lily stayed with his sister most weeks. He told himself it was easier that way. Told himself she needed stability, routine, things he couldn't provide. The truth was, he didn't know how to be her father anymore. Didn't know how to be anyone's anything. Claire Thompson had lost her husband and daughter 5 years ago. Jack knew that much. Everyone did. It had been in the news. A car accident. Icy roads. 2 lives gone in an instant. She'd taken a month off, then returned with a face that showed nothing. She never mentioned them. Never faltered. She worked harder than anyone, longer than anyone, and built a wall so high no one dared try to climb it. Until tonight. Until Jack saw her dancing alone in her office, crying to music no one else could hear. The song ended. The office fell silent. Claire reached over and stopped the music. She looked at Jack, really looked at him, and something in her expression cracked. Not much, just enough. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just held out her hand. Jack stepped into the office. He closed the door behind him. And in that moment, the boundary between CEO and employee, between stranger and stranger, shattered completely. They didn't speak at first. Claire's hand stayed extended, and Jack took it. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. He expected her to pull away, to change her mind. But she didn't. She just looked at him with eyes that had stopped trying to hide anything. The office felt smaller now, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with the space itself. Jack could hear his own heartbeat, could hear her breathing, could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on both of them. Claire stepped closer. There was no music now, just silence and the faint hum of the city outside the windows. She placed her other hand on his shoulder, light as a question. Jack hesitated, then put his hand on her waist. The red dress was silk, smooth under his palm. They stood like that for a moment, 2 people who didn't know how to begin. Then Claire started to move. Slowly, a gentle sway, nothing more. Jack followed. He wasn't good at this, hadn't been good at it even when his wife tried to teach him, laughing at his clumsy feat. But Claire didn't seem to care. She just moved, and he moved with her. They turned in slow circles across the office floor. No rhythm to follow, no beat to keep. Just two bodies trying to remember what it felt like to be close to someone without armor. Jack felt the stiffness in his shoulders start to ease. Claire's grip on his hand tightened, then relaxed. They weren't really dancing. They were just holding each other up, two people too tired to stand alone anymore. The city lights filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Neither of them spoke. Words would have ruined it. After a while, Claire stopped moving. She didn't let go of his hand, but she stepped back slightly, putting distance between them. Her face was calmer now. The tears dried on her cheeks. She looked at Jack like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, not just as an employee or a stranger, but as someone who understood. Jack wanted to say something, wanted to explain why he'd walked into her office, why he'd asked to join her, why he couldn't seem to leave. But the words didn't come. Claire spoke first. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. She said, "My husband loved to dance." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Claire looked down at their joined hands, her thumb tracing a small circle against his palm. She continued, her words coming slower now, like she was pulling them from somewhere deep. She told him about the accident, how it happened 5 years ago on a winter night, how her husband had been driving their daughter home from a recital, how the roads were icy, how another car ran a red light, how they were both gone before the ambulance even arrived. She said it all in a flat, measured tone, the way someone might read a weather report. No emotion, no tears, just facts. Jack listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty condolences. He just stood there, holding her hand, letting her speak. When she finished, the silence returned, heavier this time. Claire looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked small, vulnerable, like the armor she wore every day had finally become too heavy to carry. Jack felt his throat tighten. He knew he should say something about his own loss, about his wife, about the 3 years he'd spent trying to outrun grief, but the words felt inadequate, cheap. Instead, he said, "She made me promise something before she died." Claire's eyes stayed on him, waiting. Jack swallowed hard. He hadn't talked about this with anyone. Not his sister, not his friends, not even himself, really. But standing here, in this office, with this woman who just opened herself to him, he felt the need to say it out loud. He told Claire about his wife's last days, how weak she'd become, how the cancer had taken everything from her except her voice, how she'd held his hand in that hospital bed and made him promise not to stop living when she was gone. "Don't just exist," she'd said. "Don't just go through the motions. Live." Jack's voice cracked on the last word. He looked away, embarrassed. Claire squeezed his hand. She didn't say it was okay, didn't tell him everything would be fine. She just held on. They stood like that for a long time, two people bound together by the same kind of sorrow, the same kind of failure. Because Jack had broken his promise. He knew it. He'd been existing for 3 years, not living, going to work, coming home, avoiding his daughter, avoiding himself. And Claire had done the same. Built a company, worked endless hours, became untouchable. Neither of them had been living. They'd been hiding. Claire finally let go of his hand. She walked over to her desk and sat on the edge, her bare feet dangling above the floor. She looked exhausted, drained. But there was something else in her expression now. Something like relief. Jack stayed where he was, unsure if he should leave or stay. Claire answered the question for him. She told him to sit. So he did. He pulled a chair over and sat across from her, the distance between them small but significant. They talked for hours after that. Not about work, Not about the company, just about life, about grief, about the weight of being the one who survived. Claire told him about her daughter, about how she used to spin in circles until she got dizzy, about how she'd wanted to be a dancer when she grew up. Jack told her about Lily, about how he barely saw her anymore, about how guilty he felt every time his sister brought her by, and he couldn't find the energy to be the father she deserved. They traded stories like people trade confessions, each one heavier than the last. At some point, Claire asked him why he'd come back to the office tonight. Jack didn't lie. He told her the truth, that he couldn't stand being home, that the apartment felt like a tomb, that work was the only place where he didn't have to think about everything he'd lost. Claire nodded. She understood. She said she did the same thing. Worked late, stayed longer than anyone else, because the office was the only place where she could control something, where she could pretend she still had power over her own life. Jack asked her about the dancing, why she did it, why alone, why in secret. Claire looked down at her hands. She said it was the only time she let herself feel anything, the only time she allowed the grief to surface. During the day, she had to be strong, had to be the CEO, had to be the woman everyone expected her to be. But at night, in that empty office, she could put on a dress and remember what it felt like to be human, to be broken, to be anything other than perfect. The conversation eventually ran out of steam. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. Jack looked at the clock on Claire's desk. It was past 2 in the morning. He should have left hours ago, should have gone home, but he didn't want to. And judging by the way Claire was looking at him, she didn't want him to either. Something had shifted between them. Something fragile and dangerous. They both felt it. Jack stood up. He told Claire he should go. She didn't argue. She just walked him to the door, still barefoot, still wearing the red dress. At the threshold, she stopped him. She said his name, and he turned. For a moment, he thought she was going to say something important, something that would change everything. But she didn't. She just looked at him, her expression soft, almost vulnerable. Then she said, "Thank you." Jack didn't know what she was thanking him for staying, for listening, for not running away when he saw her at her weakest. Maybe all of it. He nodded, then he left. As he walked down the hallway, he heard her door close behind him. The sound echoed through the empty building. Jack took the elevator down, stepped out into the cold night air, and realized he didn't feel as heavy as he had when he'd arrived. Something had changed. He wasn't sure what. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he'd actually been present for something, like he'd actually been alive. The next few weeks were strange. Jack and Claire didn't talk about that night. Not at work, not in meetings, not in passing. They acted like nothing had happened, but something had. Jack could feel it every time their eyes met across a conference room, every time they passed each other in the hallway. There was a current between them now, a shared secret, and it terrified him. He started leaving work on time, going home, spending time with Lily when his sister brought her over. It wasn't perfect. He still felt lost most days. But he was trying, and that was more than he'd done in years. He didn't know if it was because of Claire or because of what she'd said to him that night. Maybe both. Maybe neither. But something had shifted. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was trying to live. Then one evening, Jack found a note on his desk. It was handwritten. Brief, just an address and a time. No name. But he knew who it was from. His hands shook as he read it. He could ignore it, pretend he never saw it. Go back to his safe, solitary existence. But he didn't. That night, he drove to the address. It was a small cafe on the edge of the city. Quiet. Out of the way. When he walked in, Claire was already there, sitting in a corner booth, wearing jeans and a sweater. He'd never seen her in anything but business attire. She looked different, softer, more real. They met like that a few more times over the following weeks, always in quiet places, always away from the office. They talked about everything and nothing, about books they'd read, movies they'd seen, memories they'd buried. It felt dangerous, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because it felt like they were stepping towards something neither of them was ready for. Jack knew people at work were starting to notice. He'd catch glances, hear whispers, the CEO and a mid-level finance guy. It didn't look good, didn't make sense, but he couldn't stop. Then Gregory showed up. Jack had heard the name before. Gregory Winters, Claire's former business partner, the man who'd helped her build Thompson Industries from the ground up after her husband died. He'd left the company 2 years ago under circumstances no one talked about, and now he was back. Jack saw him in Claire's office one afternoon, his voice loud enough to carry through the glass walls. Claire's face was unreadable, but her posture was tense. Jack felt something twist in his chest. Jealousy. Fear. He didn't know which. That evening, Claire canceled their meeting. No explanation, just a text. Jack sat in his car outside the cafe, staring at his phone, feeling like an idiot. He'd let himself believe this was real, that they were building something. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe Claire was just using him to feel less alone. Maybe he was doing the same. The thought made him sick. 2 days later, Gregory cornered Jack in the parking garage. He was tall, sharp-suited, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked Jack how things were going. Said he'd heard Jack and Claire had been spending time together. Jack didn't answer. Gregory leaned against Jack's car, casual but threatening. He told Jack that Claire was fragile, that she'd been through hell, that she didn't need someone taking advantage of her grief. The words hit like a slap. Jack wanted to defend himself. Wanted to say it wasn't like that. But Gregory kept talking. He said Claire was just running from her pain, that she'd done it before, that she'd latch on to anything that made her feel less guilty about being happy. And when the guilt caught up, she'd destroy it. Jack drove home that night feeling hollow. Gregory's words echoed in his head. Was that what this was? Was Claire just using him as an escape? Was he just a distraction? And worse, was he doing the same to her? He thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made, about Lily, about everything he'd been avoiding. Maybe this whole thing was just two broken people clinging to each other because they were too scared to face themselves. The next morning, Claire called him into her office. She looked tired, worn down. She told him they needed to stop. That whatever was happening between them, it couldn't continue. Jack felt his chest tighten. He asked why. Claire looked away. She said it wasn't fair to either of them, that they were both still grieving, that this wasn't real. It was just two people trying to escape. Jack wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come, because part of him wondered if she was right. Claire told him she needed space, needed to figure things out. Jack nodded. He left her office without saying anything, and for the first time since that night they danced together, he felt the weight of loneliness settle back over him like a blanket, heavier than before, because now he knew what it felt like to not be alone, and losing it hurt worse than never having it at all. Jack stopped going to work late. He left at 5 like everyone else, drove home, sat in his apartment, and stared at walls that didn't care. Lily came by twice that week. His sister dropped her off with a look that said she knew something was wrong but wouldn't ask. Jack tried. He made dinner, he helped with homework, he listened when she talked about school. But his mind was somewhere else, on a woman in a red dress, on a dance that meant everything and nothing, on words that had been said and couldn't be unsaid. 3 weeks passed like that. Jack saw Claire in meetings. She was professional, distant. The woman he'd held in that office might as well have been a ghost. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him beyond what was necessary, and Jack understood. This was how it had to be. They'd crossed a line, and now they were stepping back. It was the smart thing. The safe thing. But it didn't feel smart. It felt like drowning in slow motion. Then one night, Jack broke. He didn't plan it. Didn't think about it. He just got in his car and drove to Thompson Industries. It was late. Past 11. The building was dark except for a few security lights. Jack parked and sat there for a long time, hands on the wheel, trying to talk himself out of what he was about to do. But he couldn't. Because he needed to say something. Needed Claire to hear it, even if it changed nothing. He took the elevator up. The executive floor was empty, silent. Jack walked to Claire's office. The door was closed, but light showed underneath. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Claire was sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him. Jack closed the door behind him. Claire's voice came out flat. She asked what he was doing here. Jack didn't have a good answer. He just stood there, trying to find the right words. Claire finally looked at him. Her face was tired, drawn. She told him he shouldn't be here, that they'd already talked about this, that it was over. Jack shook his head. He said it wasn't over. Not for him. Claire's expression hardened. She told him he didn't understand, that this was a mistake, that they were both just looking for something to fill the emptiness, and that wasn't love. That was desperation. Jack stepped closer to her desk. He told her she was wrong, that maybe it started that way. Maybe they were both just broken people looking for a lifeline. But it had become something more, at least for him. Claire looked away. She said he didn't know what he was talking about, that he was just projecting, just looking for a replacement for what he'd lost. Jack felt anger rise in his chest. He told her that was bullshit, that she was the one running, that she was so terrified of being happy again that she'd rather burn everything down than take the risk. Claire stood up. Her hands were shaking. She told Jack to leave, but he didn't move. He asked her if she remembered what he'd told her about his wife, about the promise he'd made. Claire's jaw tightened. Jack continued. He said his wife made him promise not to stop living when she was gone. And for 3 years, he'd broken that promise every single day. He'd existed. He'd gone through the motions, but he hadn't lived. Not until that night he walked into this office and saw Claire dancing. Not until he'd asked to join her. Jack's voice cracked. He told Claire that she'd woken something in him he thought was dead, that for the first time since his wife died, he'd felt like a person again, like someone who mattered. And he knew she felt the same. He could see it in her eyes, could feel it every time they were together. But she was choosing to stay in her grief, choosing to believe that being happy again meant betraying the people they'd lost. And that was the real betrayal. Not moving forward, but staying stuck. Claire's eyes were wet now. She told Jack he didn't understand, that it wasn't that simple, that her daughter and husband were gone because of her, because she'd been working late that night, because she hadn't been there to drive them home, because she'd put the company first. And now, if she let herself be happy, if she let herself move on, what did that say about them? What did that say about their lives? Their deaths? Jack stepped around the desk. He was close enough now to see the tears on her face, close enough to touch her. But he didn't. He told Claire that her family didn't die because of her. They died because of ice, and bad timing, and a driver who ran a red light. And carrying that guilt wouldn't bring them back. It would just destroy her. He asked her what she thought they would want. If they could see her now, working herself to death, refusing to let anyone in, dancing alone in empty offices, would they want that? Or would they want her to live, to be happy, to remember them without being crushed by the weight of remembering? Claire broke. The tears came harder now, and she covered her face with her hands. Her whole body shook. Jack moved closer. He didn't touch her, just stood there, giving her space to fall apart. Claire's words came out broken, choked. She said she didn't know how. Didn't know how to let go. Didn't know how to be happy without feeling like she was erasing them. Jack's voice was quiet when he answered. He told her she didn't have to let go. She just had to make room for something else. For someone else. For herself. Claire looked up at him. Her face was raw, open. She asked him if he really believed that. If he really thought they could do this without destroying each other. Jack didn't lie. He said he didn't know. But he knew that being without her felt worse than any risk. That he'd rather take the chance and fail than spend the rest of his life wondering what could have been. Claire's breath hitched. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was tight, almost painful. She told him she was scared. Jack nodded. He said he was too. They stood like that for a long time. Then Claire did something Jack didn't expect. She let go of his hand and walked over to the corner of her office. There was a speaker there, small and sleek. She turned it on. Music filled the room, the same classical piece from that first night. Strings and piano, heavy and beautiful. Claire turned back to Jack. She held out her hand. No words, just the offer. Jack took it. They danced, slowly, carefully, like two people learning how to trust again. There was no urgency this time, no desperation, just two people choosing to be present. To be here, together. Claire rested her head against Jack's shoulder. He could feel her breathing, could feel the tension leaving her body, and for the first time in weeks, the weight in his chest lifted. Not completely, but enough. When the music ended, they didn't let go. They just stood there, holding each other. Claire spoke first. She told Jack she needed to do something she'd been avoiding for 5 years. Jack asked what. Claire said she needed to go home, to her real home, the house where her daughter used to live, where her husband used to sleep. She'd kept the house all these years, but had never gone back. Couldn't bear to step inside. But she needed to face it now. Needed to stop running. Jack asked if she wanted him to come with her. Claire looked at him. She nodded. They left the office together. Drove in separate cars through the empty streets to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was late, nearly 2 in the morning. The house stood dark and silent, a 2-story colonial with a porch that needed paint. Claire parked in the driveway and sat there for a long moment, staring at the front door. Jack pulled up behind her and waited. When she finally got out of the car, her movements were slow, deliberate. She unlocked the door like she was defusing a bomb. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it 5 years ago. Dust covered the furniture. The air smelled stale, closed off. But the memories were alive. Photos on the walls. A child's drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. Shoes by the door that no one would ever wear again. Claire stood in the entryway, frozen. Jack stayed behind her. Didn't push. Just waited. Claire moved through the house like a ghost revisiting her own life. She touched things gently. A couch, a bookshelf, a coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter. Then she stopped at a closed door at the end of the hallway. Her hand rested on the knob but didn't turn it. Jack could see her shoulders trembling. This was Emma's room, the place Claire had been avoiding for 5 years. The final boundary she couldn't cross. Jack stepped beside her. He didn't say anything, just put his hand over hers on the doorknob. Together, they turned it. Together, they pushed the door open. The room was small, painted pale yellow with clouds on the ceiling. A twin bed sat against one wall, covered in stuffed animals. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with picture books and chapter books, and everything in between. Drawings covered the walls, taped up at odd angles. A little girl's world, frozen in time. Claire stepped inside. She knelt down next to a box beside the bed and opened it. Inside were more drawings, childish crayon scribbles, stick figures, and lopsided houses. She pulled one out. It showed 3 people holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Mom, Dad, and a little girl with pigtails. Claire's hands trembled as she held it. Jack knelt beside her. He didn't say anything. Just let her sit with it. Let her remember. After a while, Claire spoke. She said her daughter's name, Emma. She'd been 7. Loved dancing. Loved spinning until she got dizzy. Loved bedtime stories and hot chocolate and singing off-key. Claire's voice broke on the last part. She said she hadn't spoken Emma's name out loud in 5 years. Hadn't let herself. Because saying it made it real. Made the loss real. Jack put his hand on her shoulder. He told her it was okay. That Emma was real. That she'd existed. That she'd mattered. And that remembering her didn't mean living in the past. It meant carrying her forward. Claire cried. Not the silent tears from before. This was deeper. Louder. Years of grief pouring out all at once. Jack held her while she broke. And when she finally stopped, when the tears ran dry, she looked different. Lighter. Like she'd been holding her breath for 5 years and finally exhaled. She looked at Jack and said thank you. Not for the comfort, but for making her face this. For not letting her run. They left the house together as the sun started to rise. Claire locked the door, but this time it felt different. Not like sealing a tomb, more like closing a chapter. She told Jack she was going to come back. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. She was going to clean the house, open the windows, let light back in. She wasn't going to live there. Couldn't. But she wasn't going to abandon it either. It would be a place to visit, to remember, to honor what had been without being destroyed by it. Claire told Jack she needed to see Gregory one more time, needed to tell him to stop, that she wasn't his to protect anymore, that she was done letting other people decide what she needed. Jack asked if she wanted him there. Claire shook her head. She said this was something she had to do alone. Jack understood. 2 days later, Claire called Jack. She told him it was done, that she'd confronted Gregory, that he'd tried to convince her she was making a mistake, that Jack was just a phase, a distraction. But she'd held her ground, told Gregory that she appreciated everything he'd done for her, but he didn't get to control her life anymore. Didn't get to tell her how to grieve or who to care about. Gregory had left angry, but he'd left. And Claire felt free. Jack asked her what happened next, what they were supposed to do now. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said she didn't know. But she wanted to try, wanted to see where this went. Not in secret, not in hiding, but in the open, together. Jack felt something settle in his chest, relief, hope, something he hadn't felt in years. He told her he wanted that too. They started small. Dinners, walks, normal things that normal people did. Jack introduced Claire to Lily. It was awkward at first. Lily was quiet, unsure, watching this stranger in her father's life with careful eyes. But Claire didn't push. She just listened, asked questions, talked about books and movies and things that didn't require trust. Yet. And slowly, the walls came down. Lily started to warm to her, started to smile more. And Jack realized Lily had been waiting for him to live again, too. That she'd been holding back because he had. Claire went back to Emma's room several more times. Each visit hurt a little less. She started to sort through things, not to pack them away or get rid of them, but to organize them. To create a space that honored Emma without being a shrine. She invited Jack one afternoon. They stood in the doorway together, looking at the small bed, the stuffed animals, the drawings on the walls. It hurt, but it was a different kind of hurt. Not the kind that destroyed, the kind that healed. Claire told Jack she was going to keep the room exactly as it was. She'd keep the house, too. It would be a place she could visit whenever she needed, to feel close to Emma and her husband, a place where their memory lived. But it wouldn't be a prison anymore. It would be a reminder that Emma had lived, that she'd been loved, and that love didn't end just because life did. Jack and Claire stood in that room, hand in hand, and made a choice, not to forget, not to move on, but to move forward, to carry the people they'd lost with them instead of being buried by them, to honor the promises they'd made, to live together. They danced one more time, not in an office, not in secret, but in Claire's living room with the windows open and the sunlight streaming in. No music, just the sound of their breathing, just the feeling of being alive. Being present, being here. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt like they were drowning. They felt like they were finally learning how to swim.
This script is a deeply moving exploration of grief, guilt, and healing, though with quiet intensity and emotion honesty, making the love story feel earned, human, and profoundly real. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing how it made you feel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that truly matter.